Jake Henderson woke before dawn, a hint of crimson sky illuminating the pine trees that framed his cabin near Denali National Park. The air was bracingly cold, but he found it strangely invigorating. He had chosen this place to escape the constant buzz of city life and find himself again. After losing his job in Denver, he had decided to spend a few weeks in Alaska, hoping that fresh air and solitude would rekindle a long-lost spark in him. He still felt the weight of all that had happened, memories of slammed doors, hurried farewells, and the stifling sense of not knowing what came next. Yet here, in a land that felt both boundless and intimate, he suspected he might rediscover some sense of purpose. Jake had heard tales of the wilderness of moose sighted at dawn, Dall sheep perched high on rocky ledges, and the possibility of encountering grizzlies along trails that wound deep into Denali National Park. Growing up in a small town in Colorado, he was no stranger to wildlife, but there was an unmistakable sense of awe about Alaska. The mountains felt taller, their peaks pressed hard into a crisp sky, and the forests appeared endless, layered like green velvet carpets. Even the wind carried a subdued roar, whispering secrets of uncharted paths. On that particular day, a strange restlessness urged Jake to rise early. He put on his heavy boots and layered up in thick fleece. The window of the cabin afforded him a fleeting view of the sun cresting over the horizon. He stuffed a few energy bars and a bottle of water into his backpack, along with a small journal where he jotted down fleeting thoughts or sketches of anything that caught his eye. He wanted to go hiking, maybe in one of the lesser-traveled areas near the park's boundary. There was a hushed serenity to the outskirts, and though he was aware of the inherent risk of solitude, he felt an irresistible pull. He chose a trail that wove through the spruce forest, weaving in and out of small glens and gradually ascending toward higher elevations. The path wasn't an official route marked by the National Park Service, so he knew it might be rough going. Dead branches littered the ground, and the trail itself was sometimes little more than faint tracks in the underbrush. But he was ready for a challenge, driven by a need to find solace in nature's rawness. Along the way, the smell of fresh pine collided with the tang of damp earth. His breath steamed in the frosty air, curling upward before vanishing. It wasn't long before he found a sense of peace in the monotonous crunch of his boots against the twigs. With each step, the weight of the past seemed to lighten, if only by a fraction. He was reflecting on his time in Denver, how he'd lost his position at the marketing firm, how the daily grind had slowly eroded his passion and drive when a sudden movement in the corner of his eye made him freeze. He didn't see anything at first, just a quietness that draped over the forest. A squirrel darted up the trunk of a spruce, its small claws scraping the bark. Beyond that, the woods stood silent, solemn, thick with secrets. Jake shrugged it off and kept walking, telling himself he was being jumpy. But moments later, he heard a soft rustling from behind. Turning his head, he saw a blur of motion, something large, brown, and unbelievably silent. A wild bear. Jake's heart thumped so hard against his ribs he thought it might burst through. The bear, broad-shouldered with a thick coat of dark fur, was standing just a short distance away, hidden partly by a stand of shrubs. It was undeniably a grizzly, its hump protruding above the shoulders, its muzzle a lighter brown hue. Time seemed to stretch. He recalled reading that if you encounter a bear, you're not supposed to run. Running triggers their chase instinct. You're also advised to speak calmly, avoid sudden movements, and gauge the animal's behavior. Jake slowly took a step forward, letting his breath out in small, quiet streams. The bear's ears pricked up. He mustered a steady voice. "Easy, easy, girl." He didn't know if it was a female, but the words just spilled out. The bear stared back, and in those eyes Jake sensed something beyond mere animal instinct, a primal intelligence. Calm, yet formidable. After a few moments, it turned and ambled off into the brush. Jake felt as though an invisible thread had just been severed. Spooked, but not ready to let fear win, he continued walking along the faint trail. He tried to push the bear from his mind, reminding himself that this was their domain and that spotting one was part of Alaska's wild allure. But every so often, he would stop and glance backward. That was when he realized the bear was following him. Not aggressively, not running, but walking, keeping pace. Sometimes it would disappear behind trees, as if content to stay on the periphery of his sight, but always, if he peered carefully, he could glimpse that familiar shape, silent and ever-present. Jake's palms grew clammy inside his gloves, and the back of his neck prickled with an acute awareness. Fear threatened to overtake him, but an even stronger curiosity took root. Why was the bear following him? He had heard stories of bears trailing hikers, either out of territorial instinct or mild interest. He knew enough to remain cautious, very cautious, but something about its persistent presence made him wonder. It wasn't charging or acting overtly hostile. If anything, it seemed contemplative, measured. For miles, Jake walked, heart pounding in tandem with the rhythm of his boots. He traversed a shallow creek, water glinting over smooth stones. He clambered over fallen logs, encrusted with fuzzy moss. The forest grew darker as tall spruce canopies blocked out what little sunlight remained. Yet the bear followed. Occasionally, Jake tried to speak to it, feeling a bit foolish. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." His voice trailed off in the stillness. The only response was the faint snap of branches when the bear navigated the dense undergrowth. Gradually, a strange calmness replaced Jake's trembling fear. He kept a safe distance, aware that at any point the situation could change. But something in the bear's demeanor, its unhurried gait, its head sometimes tilted, as if observing, put him at a kind of ease. Hours slipped by in this odd dance of man and beast, each measuring the other's intentions. When the late afternoon sun sent shafts of orange light cutting through the forest gloom, Jake's legs were growing stiff and weary. He found a small clearing, patches of grass scattered among a ring of ancient birch trees, their papery bark curling off in white ribbons. The clearing smelled clean, scented with faint traces of wildflowers and damp lichen. A larger fallen birch lay at the clearing's edge. Jake considered stopping there to rest, maybe munch on an energy bar, but stopping meant the bear might close the distance, and that thought kept him uneasy. He glanced back, watching. The bear had paused at the edge of the clearing, its massive paws silent against a bed of needles. Shadows danced along its fur. The creature looked at him with an intensity that nearly knocked the wind out of him. In that moment, Jake felt more seen than he had in months. The stresses and failures of his life, the disappointments he'd gathered, none of that mattered here, in this raw connection to something wild and unadorned. Warily, Jake walked to the fallen birch, sinking down onto the log. He forced himself to breathe slowly, calm his racing heart. The bear remained at the clearing's edge. Its muzzle twitched as it lifted its nose to catch his scent. For a few silent minutes, neither moved. Then, with an almost imperceptible gentleness, the bear inched forward. Jake's stomach did a flip. Still, he didn't run, nor did he shout. He just watched, posture rigid with a mix of fascination and a near-paralyzing fear. When the bear reached the center of the clearing, it halted again. Jake's throat felt dry. He slid his backpack onto his lap, unzipped it, and pulled out a small notebook. Maybe he thought if he pretended this was routine, just a hiker taking a break, the bear would maintain this strange truce. With trembling hands, he scribbled a short passage. "I can't explain the intensity of this moment. The bear is right here. I can feel its gaze, and somehow I'm not terrified. I'm in awe." His pen scraped the page. Each second felt like an hour. Occasionally the bear huffed, exhaling a soft rumble that vibrated through the clearing. Then, like a dream dissolving, the moment ended. The bear turned and padded toward the opposite side of the clearing, back into the thick foliage. Jake listened intently, expecting it to return, but it didn't. The forest felt quiet once again, except for the faint chirping of jays and the flutter of distant wings. Relief flooded him, followed quickly by an odd pang of loss. Something transformative had happened in that clearing, an experience that mingled fear and reverence. And just like that, it was over. Jake pressed on, uncertain of his next move, but determined to find a safe path back to the cabin before nightfall. He felt the hush of the forest more acutely now, as if every needle and leaf bore witness to that silent exchange. His legs were burning from exertion, and though his mind reeled with disbelief, a part of him hoped he might see the bear again. It was nearing dusk when he decided he had better retrace his steps, ensure he could reach safety. Picking his way back, he moved with careful strides. The world around him tinted a dusky purple. The sky above the treetops looked bruised, pregnant with the promise of a star-bright night. Jake turned on a small flashlight, its beam bouncing wildly with each step. Occasionally he'd catch the soft rustle of movement in the underbrush, sending his heart into a sudden gallop, but each time the rustle ceased. Maybe it was just a hare or a fox. Finally, he found the creek again. He recognized certain bends in the trail, the silhouettes of particular trees. Relief washed over him. He was about an hour from his cabin. Despite his earlier fear, a sense of triumph filled him. He'd walked for miles with a wild bear in tow and lived to tell the tale. And not just tell it, but be changed by it. He sensed that part of him had awakened, the part that used to dream big and live for the moment. Half an hour later, the sky was a tapestry of stars when he glimpsed the cabin's faint outline. A swirl of emotion welled in him, gratitude, pride, even a touch of sadness. He paused outside the door, taking one last look at the dark forest. He whispered, "Thank you," though he wasn't sure to whom or what he was speaking. Then he went inside. Jake slept fitfully. Dreams tugged in all directions by images of that deep brown gaze and the echo of the bear's soft huff. Morning came, pale sunlight seeping through the cabin's windows. He felt an urge to go back into the woods. Instead, he forced himself to eat a hot breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast, and reflect. If the bear had stuck around, it could still be out there. He wasn't sure if returning to the same trail was wise, yet that call was irresistible. By midday, Jake found himself donning his boots again, this time throwing in a few more supplies, a larger first aid kit, water purification tablets, and extra snacks. If he was going to push further, he might as well be prepared. There was a tether pulling him toward that clearing, compelling him to see if the bear was still around. Part of him felt insane. You don't just go seeking out a grizzly. But another part felt an unshakable longing, as though there was something unfinished between them. So he began again, retracing his steps with deliberate caution. The pine needles crunched beneath his boots, the forest alive with midday activity. Red squirrels chattered overhead, and once he startled a ptarmigan that shot into the air with frenzied flapping. He moved slowly, scanning the path for signs of fresh bear scat or newly broken branches. Hours passed, and the sun warmed his shoulders through gaps in the canopy. When he reached the clearing, it lay bathed in a glowing light. The birch trees stood stately, like silent guardians. Jake walked to the fallen log and sat down again, half expecting the bear to materialize as it had done the day before. But time slid by. He ate a protein bar, sipping from his water bottle, scanning the edges of the clearing for movement. A part of him felt foolish. Another part was disappointed. The bear had gone on its way, as wild creatures do. Maybe this was how it should end, one extraordinary encounter, ephemeral as a dream. Yet he lingered, writing in his journal, attempting to capture the depth of what he'd felt out there. He wrote about how small he'd felt in the face of something so majestic, yet how strangely alive that smallness made him. He noted the tension in his chest that had slowly melted into something akin to wonder, and he scribbled about his life in Denver, how somewhere along the way he'd begun to feel numb. "I forgot how to be brave," he wrote, "until now." Lost in thought, he didn't notice at first the branches parting on the far side of the clearing. His ears picked up the subtle break of twigs, and he glanced up. His breath hitched. The bear had returned. Its huge head rose above a clump of tall grasses near an aspen trunk, muzzle glistening in the afternoon sun. Jake's skin prickled with electricity, part fear, part exhilaration. He set his journal aside and slowly rose to his feet, not wanting to appear threatening. The bear considered him for a few heartbeats. For a moment, Jake braced himself. Any movement from the bear could turn dangerous. Instead, it ambled forward just as cautiously as the day before. It stopped again, about 15 yards away, an unspoken boundary between them. Jake felt tears prickling behind his eyes. It made no rational sense. He was simply overwhelmed. He realized that in this moment he was seeing life unmasked. All pretense was stripped away. The bear's strength, its power to end him in a single swipe, was offset by a surprising calmness in its bearing. He spoke softly, not even sure what he was saying, just letting words tumble out. "I see you. I'm grateful. I'm sorry if I intrude." In the hush that followed, Jake could only marvel. He turned, scanning the forest edges for any sign of cubs. It wouldn't do to cross a mother protecting her young, but he saw nothing. Maybe this bear was on its own, wandering the outskirts in search of salmon or berries. Why it had chosen to follow him, to observe him, was still a mystery. Time stretched. The bear huffed again, swinging its massive head from side to side, nosing the air. Then came the moment that made Jake's heart skip. The bear moved a few steps closer. Jake stiffened, though he kept himself rooted, refusing to bolt. The bear was so close he could see the ripple of its muscles under thick fur, the flexing pads of its paws. All it would take was one wrong instinct, but instead of aggression, the bear raised its snout, almost as if to sniff the wind near Jake's face. Jake let out a trembling exhale. This was insane, dangerously so. And yet there was something profoundly sacred about it. He reached into his pocket, fumbling until his fingers closed around the small camera phone he'd carried for safety. He knew that if he made a quick move, the bear might react unpredictably, so he eased it out slowly, clicking it on. He wanted to capture this moment as proof, but also because it felt too big to trust only to memory. His thumb shook as he pressed the button, the shutter sounding unnaturally loud in the hush. The bear flinched at the click, taking a step back. Jake's heart lurched, and he whispered an apology. "It's okay. Sorry." He turned the camera away, not wanting to agitate the animal further. Slowly, the bear relaxed, stepping back into its former position. Jake could hardly believe what was happening. A moment of communion, man and bear, hearts pounding in the silent space of a sunlit glen. Their standoff, if it could be called that, lasted only a handful of minutes, but for Jake, it felt timeless. Finally, as if answering an unspoken cue, the bear turned and started walking away. Jake watched, breath bated, expecting it to fade into the trees. But after putting about 30 yards between them, the bear paused. It looked over its shoulder. Jake took a reflexive step forward, arms half raised, compelled by a confusing swirl of longing. That was when the bear did something he never expected. It rose onto its hind legs, towering to a massive height, broad arms at its sides like an ancient sentinel. It wasn't a threatening move, rather. The bear seemed to be investigating him from a different vantage point, or perhaps issuing a gentle warning. From this posture, Jake caught a clear glimpse of its chest, fur parted, revealing scars, old wounds that told stories of other battles. Then the bear dropped back down onto all fours and loped into the woods, dissolving into the tapestry of leaves and shadows. Jake stood rooted for several minutes, chest heaving with adrenaline. When at last his pulse steadied, he let out a long sigh that nearly turned into a laugh. He couldn't believe his eyes, couldn't believe this improbable meeting between him and a force of the wild. His fear, once crippling, had transformed into something else: respect, humility, and a fierce sense of aliveness. That evening, he returned to the cabin, phone in hand, replaying the few photos he'd managed to take. The images were blurry, capturing only the outlines of the bear and the hush of the glen. Still, they were enough. Enough to prove it wasn't just a dream, enough to remind him of something essential he'd nearly lost: the raw beauty of stepping outside his limitations. Over the next week, Jake found himself thinking often about that bear. Each day, he woke early to explore new trails or revisit the clearing, though he never encountered his silent companion again. He felt changed, as if Alaska's wild heartbeat now resonated in his own chest. Little by little, the burdens he'd carried from Denver, unemployment, regrets, self-doubt, began to fade. In their place grew a newfound sense of possibility. He began to plan. Perhaps he'd write a memoir of his time in Denali, weaving in the lessons he'd gleaned from that extraordinary encounter. Perhaps he'd commit himself to environmental work, driven by a fresh reverence for the natural world. Each idea felt invigorating rather than daunting. He no longer saw life's struggles as insurmountable. After all, if he could stand within arm's reach of a grizzly bear, if he could share a moment of unspoken understanding with a creature so powerful he could face the uncertainties of his own life. On Jake's last night in the cabin, he stepped onto the small porch. Above, the sky unfurled in all its Alaskan glory, stars piercing the darkness with unmatched brilliance. A faint aurora shimmered at the horizon, ribbons of green dancing like spirits. Breathing in the crisp night air, he thought about how strange it was that a terrifying encounter had become the catalyst for hope. He recognized a quiet resilience unfurling inside him, a willingness to keep going, keep believing. Before bed, he tried to capture that sense of wonder in his journal. There's something in the eyes of a wild animal that holds a mirror to your soul. When the bear looked at me, I saw my fears, my hopes, all reflected back, and in that reflection I realized there's more to me than I believed. I am not powerless. Neither am I alone. Tomorrow I'll leave this cabin, but I'm not leaving unchanged. The bear followed me for miles, and I followed something too, a path that led me to myself. In the morning, the sun rose over the spruce forest, painting the world in a gentle gold. Jake gathered his belongings, loading them into his old truck. He cast one last glance at the forest's edge, half expecting a dark shape to step out from the shadows. There was nothing, only the solemn hush of tall pines, and that was all right. He smiled softly, touched a hand to his chest as if to acknowledge the abiding presence of all he'd experienced. When he finally drove away, he took more than just photographs and footprints. He carried a renewed sense of awe, a deeper understanding of how small and interconnected we are in this vast tapestry of life. In the weeks that followed, he would share his story with friends back in Colorado, describing the moment he turned and couldn't believe his eyes. They would tease him with disbelief or exclaim with wide-eyed wonder, but no matter how they reacted, Jake knew the truth of what had happened out there near Denali National Park. A wild bear had followed him for miles peacefully, curiously, and in turning around to face it, he'd also confronted his own fears, illusions, and doubts. He left the woods with a gentler heart, a stronger spirit, and a soul blazing with the knowledge that resilience isn't just about surviving. It's about learning to walk unafraid, even when the wild itself is breathing down your neck. And sometimes it's about recognizing that the very thing you fear might be the key to rediscovering your lost connection to life, to others, and ultimately, to yourself.